again that this event is being live streamed on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And you can pass on messages to any one of your friends and join in on any of those platforms if in fact they'd like to be a part of this event. So I'd like to welcome all our attendees out from all around the world, and thank you again for taking the time to be with us today. The World Crime Direct is one of the flagship events at Afrexim Bank. It's a series that was inaugurated in 2017 in honor of a really great man who left an indelible mark and was fundamental to the establishment of this big institution we call the African Export-Import Bank today. We honor his life through this event, the life he lived, and the causes for which he fought. This event is usually held on the sidelines of the World Bank meetings, and typically it's a 5-course dinner where you can sit down and enjoy a lovely meal, network, make new friends, connect with the old, and of course have a thought-provoking lecture on our African, on our beautiful African continent. However, due to COVID-19, obviously, things have changed and we've had to adapt ourselves to a new normal. What I can promise you, however, is the latter, a thought-provoking lecture which will be delivered today by our guest speaker. Obviously, COVID-19 has changed a lot of things, and we're hoping that by this time next year, we'll all be able to gather once again and this time celebrate this anniversary of the Babakar India lecture. So to that end, I hope you're all well, you and your families, and I hope everyone is staying safe. Before I get into the crux of the event for today, however, I'd like to go over a couple of housekeeping items with you. For those of you who are not familiar with this platform, it's very user-friendly. The screens in front of you are very, you can minimize them, maximize them, or resize them for whatever suits you. So please take a second to adjust that console to what works best for you. Sorry. If you're logged in on a mobile device, I'd like to implore you to switch to either a personal laptop or a computer. You just have a much better experience on one of those. There's also a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Please take a second to post any comments you have in there, chat and let us know how the event is going. We do have almost 2,000 people who will be joining us today on this event, so we may not be able to get to all your questions, but this is this opportunity to let us know how the event is going and of course how we can bring you better events in the future. There's also going to be a survey at the end of the event. Please take a second to fill that out. Let us know how you thought the event went, because obviously we want to constantly and continuously improve to make these events better and better in the future. So let me quickly run and introduce you to our moderator. His name is Mr. Godfrey. He's someone who understands Africa's economic story and the enormous potential that the continent holds. He's worn many hats, which include the Director of Research at Training at the Indian Group and the Chief Editor at CNBC Africa. He covered the African story for many decades, and in the last 15 years has been a business journalist with Reuters, Bloomberg, and CNBC Africa. Before he comes on, however, I'd like Oliver to kindly run our introductory sequence for the Babakar India event 2020. Thank you so much, and welcome again to the 4th annual Babakar Ndiaye lecture. So let me introduce my brother, Mr. Godfrey Mutizwa. He is a son of Zimbabwe and currently coming to us live from Johannesburg, South Africa. Godfrey, if you can hear me, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Des. Thank you, Adeze, for inviting us, and thank you for the warm welcome, and thank you for the nice African music that I could pick up in the 203 bars that we're able to listen to. I wanted to start by being careful and saying, all protocol observed. It's an absolute honor and pleasure to be the moderator today for the 4th Babakar Ndiaye Lecture 2020. Adeze has exposed me a little bit by pointing out my many years writing the African story. It's a story that I've absolutely enjoyed. But it is also a story that has taken many turns. And I think all of us here today will recognize we live in two epochal events that will forever rewrite the rules of the world and the rules of how we've conducted business. We have, of course, in the United States, an election that has fixated everybody in terms of the personalities that are involved and the policies that they pursue and the impact that they have on our continent. There's much to think about. Then, of course, there's COVID-19, which has rewritten the rules of trade and investment like no other pandemic in our history, I think, at least for those of us who are alive today. But it is also a pandemic that has rewritten the rules in a way that enables us, perhaps, to rise up at the table and take our place and make sure that our voice is heard. Over the next 1.5 hours or so, you're going to hear from about 6 very important voices, and the delivery of the message is going to come in different forms. You're going to get a lecture, yes, and I know some of us left school a long time ago. You're going to get a lecture today, but we're also going to hear thoughtful interventions that are going to come through, including the president of the Africa Export-Import Bank, Professor Benedict Orama. We're also going to hear from Ms. Aruma Ote. If you haven't heard about her, well, you do need to have heard about her because she headed one of the biggest institutions in the world, which is the World Bank as vice president. Right now, she's busy cranking up her thoughts again and thinking, and she's back as an academic. We're also going to hear from the chief economist of Afrexim Bank, Dr. Fofak. And last but not least, 2 of our messages are going to come through music and poetry. Because when you look all around the world, the influence of African music cannot be ignored without question. So once again, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. And thank you for being part of this important conversation. Let me introduce our next speaker. As I said, she was at the World Bank. She was with the Nigerian Exchange Commission. And I remember many a time when we would have her here on CNBC Africa and other platforms talking about important reforms and interventions that would enable the Nigerian economy to take advantage of the marketplaces that were being created around the continent. Ms. Aruma Ote is an academic now, and she is at the University of Oxford, where she has been there since January 2019. She has worked throughout many areas of economic development, including, as I said, capital markets, as well as financial technology. She is also a member of the London Stock Exchange Africa Advisory Group. Again, let me restate, in case you did not hear me properly, previously Treasurer and Vice President of the World Bank, Director General, Securities and Exchange Commission, Nigeria, Group Vice President and Group Treasurer, African Development Bank, an important institution in the execution of African dreams in terms of uniting the continent and making sure that we are able to absolutely capture the potential of the African continent. She has also served on several boards and has received several awards, including Nigeria's Office of the Order of Niger, National Honor in 2018. And she was also one of the Powerless 2020 top 100 people of Black heritage in the UK. I could go on and on and on. But let me pause and invite Ms. Aruma Ote. Madam, the floor is yours.
Thank you, my brother, Godfrey Mutizwa. President Orama, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, it is indeed an honor and privilege for me to say a few words about Dr. Babaka Ndiaye, who was the president of the African Development Bank from 1985 to 1995. I fondly called him Dad, so permit me to give you a very personal introduction of this great man. I first heard about Dr. Babaka Ndiaye in 1989 when I was studying for my MBA at Harvard Business School in Boston. He had graced the front cover of a global financial publication targeted at the largest institutional investors in the world. In his interview, he articulated a compelling vision of Africa as an economic powerhouse. He also explained how the African Development Bank was helping Africa realize this vision. That vision of Africa, which he articulated in 1989, has never left me. I subsequently joined the African Development Bank in April of 1992 and worked there for 17 years. Dr. Ndiaye and I therefore overlapped for 3 years. As president of the African Development Bank, Dr. Ndiaye would periodically visit offices of staff who worked at the headquarters in Abidjan. I met him at a close range for the first time during one of such visits soon after I joined the African Development Bank in 1992. It was supposed to be a brief interaction. He was with some members of his leadership team and was supposed to quickly shake my hand and go on to the next office. He, however, decided to engage me in a discussion. As I found out later, because I was a new staff, he asked and listened to my views of the African Development Bank. He wanted to hear about my recent work trip at the time to Sudan, report that I was working on to send to the board. He asked about my family and whether I was improving my French and also whether I was enjoying living in Ivory Coast. I found him so human. He reiterated the same vision that he had articulated in the cover story I read in 1989. I was stunned and have not forgotten that first meeting because he exhibited what I consider unique attributes associated with extraordinary leadership. He was passionate about Africa. He listened. He had empathy. He shared such enormous wisdom with me in a very short time. I am fortunate that he became a lifelong mentor. I learned a lot from him. He believed in me way before I believed in myself. There was no job that I competed for or role that I accepted without seeking his advice. His perspectives were always invaluable. He was a godly man. He was caring and generous to all who encountered him. Everywhere he went, Canada, Egypt, Ethiopia, India, Japan, Nigeria, Rwanda, South Africa, the United Kingdom, and the United States, to name a few countries, people flocked around him, perhaps to learn from his nuggets of wisdom, perhaps to be inspired. I marveled at how one individual could have so much love to give any day and anywhere. As a leader, I try my best to live by the tenets that he taught me through his life and his guidance. Dr. Babaka Ndiaye was a fine professional and had great pride in his work. To him, he was always building a beautiful mosque or cathedral, not just laying bricks. He had great pride in Africa and its people. He was loved inside and outside of Africa and got many awards and recognitions in every African country and globally. He lived by the saying, "United we stand," and the African proverb, "To go far, we must go together." He was passionate about the collective good and served Africa and society meritoriously until he passed away on 13th July 2017. He believed that nurturing both the private and public sectors towards a public-private partnership for economic transformation was key to unleashing Africa's economic potential. He also understood the importance of trade and worked hard to ensure that Afrexim Bank was established in 1993. He was infinitely proud of Afrexim Bank. I'm sure he would be equally proud that the Africa Continental Free Trade Area has now come into effect with the support of the African Export-Import Bank. He similarly worked hard for the establishment of the Africa Reinsurance Company in 1973, Shelter Afrique in 1982, the Africa Business Roundtable in 1990, as well as numerous initiatives that have fostered Africa's economic progress. I could go on and on about the remarkable contribution of my dad and professional mentor. He was not just a great banker and leader, but also a great institutional builder. To my dear dad, we will never forget you because you were a champion of Africa, a man of distinction, a leader par excellence, and a worthy ambassador of Africa. You have written your name in gold in the annals of history. To Dr. Ndiaye's family, my profound gratitude for letting Africa and us all share him with you. To Professor Orama, the president of Afrexim Bank, my sincere appreciation for honoring the legacy of my dear dad, Dr. Babak Ndiaye, and for inspiring Africa to remember to celebrate the life of its exceptional leaders who have served it well, so that more role models of leadership will emerge to realize and sustain the vision of Africa as an economic powerhouse. Thank you for your leadership and the great work that you and your team are doing for Africa. I know my dad remains proud of you and your work. The theme you selected for this year's lecture, Africa and the Remaking of the New World Order, is one that fits the extraordinary times that society faces. I hope that this year's lecture will indeed be a call to action for each one of us. I hope it will inspire each one of us to emulate Dr. Babak Ndiaye and contribute to turning Africa into an economic powerhouse. His legacy lives on, even as his soul continues to rest in eternal peace. Thank you.
Godfrey, if you're there, can you hear us? You can go ahead. All right, it seems we may have lost him for a second. Thank you so much, Ms. Ote. That was beautiful, wonderful words spoken about a wonderful man. He made an indelible impact on the continent and the world at large, and we continue to honor the life that he lived. Thank you so much. Next in the program for today, we are going to have a delivery by a wonderful poet who has been with us. He's actually no stranger to Afrexim Bank. His name is DK Chukwu Mary J. Excellent at what he does, and he's written a very, very thought-provoking poem, which I'm very, very sure you're all going to love. And I hope you listen intently, because it is going, and it promises really to be a very, very power-packed, inspirational message that we all need to take away, even in the world today. So, introducing Mr. DK Chukwu Mary J.
Hello, my name is Dike Chukwumeriji. I am a poet, and it is my pleasure to be with you today at the Babaka 2020 lecture. I will be sharing a poem titled, Like This We Find Our Memories. I'll get straight to it. In my culture, there is no death. There is only a journey to an elevated world from which the departed watch over the earth. This is why we pour libation. This is why we call the names of our fathers and our mothers with respect, for they are always with us, listening with the ears of the wind, watching with the eyes of dawn, even through the wilderness years when we struggle to remember whose children we are. Till a careless shovel breaks the ground and finds a tomb, whose voice, though many centuries old, is still loud enough to be heard. There, at Saqqara, on the western banks of the Nile, there, just yesterday, we pulled 59 graves out of dust that had not been disturbed in 3,000 years. Like this, we found our memories. Our memories of Imhotep, that African man who fathered a European god, for the Romans drank deep from the wells of the Greeks, but the Greeks had drunk deep from the rivers of the Nile. Like this, we find our memories of Zosa, of that first time in human history a building was constructed entirely of stone here on this black earth, before the Eiffel Tower, before the Empire State Building, before the Burj Khalifa, here on this black earth. Khufu built a pyramid that stood for 38 centuries as the tallest structure man had ever seen. Like this, we find our memories there, in the defiance of the modern Sudanese woman. There, we find 19th century Taitu Betul rallying the hearts of the Ethiopians at the Battle of Adwa. There, we find 17th century Nzinga drawing a line in the sand in Angola against the expansion of imperialism. There, we find 20th century Konya, Nwanne Dianwugo, those women of Aba, southeastern Nigeria, who did not need an American to tell them that there is something wrong with taxation without representation, that there is something right about citizens who have the courage to step forward. These truths have indigenous roots. You see, freedom is not an expatriate on this continent. No. That urge to follow the wind, to travel across borders, to resist the limitations of boundaries, that urge was what took man out of this cradle of humanity in the first place. The languages of Niger Congo were opening new trails from Cameroon to Cape Town long before Columbus set sail. You see, progress is not an expatriate on this continent. No. We do not need to be taught how to innovate. We only need to remember that the people of North, in the age of stone, invented the working of iron, that the Kushites created their own alphabets, that Swahili is the manifestation of centuries of intercontinental diplomacy, that Timbuktu was a city of libraries and philosophy, that those entrepreneurs who built those trade routes across the desert were Africans. That is why that coin is called the Golden Guinea. Tell me, where did it all go? This land that inspired the stories of the journeys of Sinbad, this land that inspired the legend of Prester John, of a Christian monarch holed up in a mountain fortress, this land that inspired the tales of King Solomon's mines, of a ground so full of treasure it cropped out in its dust, this land that inspired the writings of Ibn Battuta, of Ibn Khaldun, this land that gave refuge to Leo Africanus, to those persecuted Muslims and Jews fleeing the Spanish Inquisition, this land from which Hannibal set out on his quest to conquer the eternal city, this land from which Mansur Abubakar set sail to export his culture and civilization to the Americas, did you not know that the first African Americans were explorers, not slaves? Tell me, where did it all go? When did we begin to forget the names of our ancestors, of Hatshepsut, of Mutota, of Sugulonjata, of Tin Hinan? When did the sun begin to set on our recollections of this place? This place that has endured the invasions of Assyrians, of Persians, of Greeks, of Romans, of Arabs, of Ottomans, of Europeans, yet still stands. That is why Achebe said that until the lions have their own historian, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. It is true that 400 years of slavery has tried to erase our memory of the fact that the Mandinka, the Fulani, the Kanuri, the Bini, the Baganda, the Amhara, the Zulus all built multi-ethnic and functional states. It is true that 100 years of colonialism has tried to erase our memory of the fact that the Kikuyu, the Tiv, the Igbo, the Tuaregs all evolved societies in which power was held not in a king, but in the systematic organization of the peoples themselves. It is true at the Berlin Conference, and the ways we have been taught since then to tell our own history has tried to erase our memory of the fact that Africa was not born on its knees. This present of dysfunctional states and a permanent third world status, this present is not an accurate reflection of our past. This gives me hope, for the apple can never fall far from the tree. You see, the snake will always give birth to something that is long. This gives me hope that one day a careless shovel, hidden perhaps in the works of Sheikh Anta Diop or the novels of Ngugi wa Thiong'o, in the poetry of Lebo Mashile or the plays of Wole Soyinka, in the pottery of Ladi Kwali or the music of Makeba, that one day a careless shovel will break the ground of this our current amnesia and cause us to remember whose children we are. Cause us to remember that in our African hearts we carry the capacity to be as relevant to the construction of the new world as we were to the old one. Cause us to remember that in our African souls we carry still and always the ability to rise. Thank you.
Wow, you can certainly hear the lion roar, and you can certainly hear the pride with which he speaks of the knowledge of the continent. He speaks of the history of the continent, and perhaps some of the missteps along the way, and how perhaps we can begin to try and find them and ensure we do not miss the next opportunity. This technology is wonderful. So here we are from all parts of the world, connected by thin wires, and then sometimes we fail the technology rather than the technology failing us. So there we are talking and celebrating, and I had forgotten to make myself be heard. Now I can be heard, and I'm sure and I hope that you all can hear me. Thank you, GK. Thank you for celebrating Mother Africa. Thank you for celebrating the birth of knowledge, where it all started. We continue on our program, reminding you again that we are celebrating the life of a great man. We are celebrating the life of Baba Kandiaye, a man, as we heard from the beginning, who was absolutely conscientious in everything that he did. He started the race, and along the way, other leaders picked up the baton. And one of those who picked up the baton is our next speaker. Let me introduce Dr. Benedicto Ramba, president of the Africa Exporting Bank. He has been in this position since September 2015. I was there when he was elected, and I remember we were talking about how key it was that we were able to get Africa's intra-African trade figures higher than where they were. I think then, if I remember correctly, we were talking figures around 13, 14% of thereabouts of the trade that Africans do amongst each other. We were comparing them around the other continents and other regions. It was not worth a comparison. And he committed to making sure that those figures, when we next speak about them, they are going to be respectable figures. I think we all know where the story has gone since then. Let me quickly just give you an overview of the man. As I said, current president of the Africa Export-Import Bank. Prior to this role, he was executive vice president in charge of business development and corporate banking. What did he do when he was in that position? Well, he supervised our business development functions, including trade finance, project and export development finance, syndications, and specialized finance and corporate finance and advisory services. He also supervised the research and knowledge management functions of the bank and the assistant the then president of the bank in overseeing its strategic planning and international cooperation functions. Before he joined the bank, he was with the Nigeria Export-Import Bank, Maxim, from 1992 to 1994. He has written a book. If you haven't seen it, let me tell you what the name of the book is. It's called Foundations of Structured Trade Finance. And he has written over 35 articles. He speaks all around the world. You can imagine what he talks about. I don't know if anyone wants to be paid for guessing what he talks about when he talks about the African continent. It's got to be trade finance. It's got to be increasing Africa's own share of trade in the world. He also continues to write, even in this busy schedule. He sits on the editorial boards of Trade and Forfeiting Review and Journal of African Trade. He's also a member of the consultative board of the World Economy of International Cocoa Organization. Not to say and forget that he is the foremost voice on African trade. Ladies and gentlemen, let me bring to you Dr. Benedict Oki Orama.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Our special guest, Professor Kishore Mahbubani, founding Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy and Distinguished Fellow of the Asia Research Institute. Our guest speaker, Professor Aroma Ote, who you've just heard from. Our guest poet, Mr. Dike Chukwumerije. Honorable ministers, representatives of the diplomatic corps, representatives of international organizations, central bank governors, members of the Ndiaye family, CEOs, managing directors, and captains of industry here present, distinguished representatives of Afrexim Bank shareholders, members of the board of directors and management of Afrexim Bank, members of the board of directors and management of the Fund for Export Development in Africa, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the board of directors and management of Afrexim Bank, I would like to welcome you all to the fourth Obaka Ndiaye lecture. It is also my singular honor and privilege to thank His Excellency Professor Kishore Mahbubani for accepting our invitation as a keynote speaker for this year's lecture. We also thank Professor Aroma Ote, who is very busy as a professor now, and who found the time to also join us and made very insightful comments about Dr. Ndiaye. A special thanks also
to Mr. Dikechukwu Merije, who inspires us always with his poetry. The Babakandeye lecture was established 4 years ago to honor Dr. Ndiaye's memory and sustain his vision of using strong continental institutions as instruments for delivering Africa's development and integration. Afrexim Bank was inspired by his vision and the relevance of the institutions he helped create while he was at the helm as the 5th president of the African Development Bank. Professor Ote recounted for us about some of those institutions, and we all know the impact they are making. His legacy is evident in the development impact all those institutions have made and continue to make. Afrexim Bank stands today as an indisputable evidence of Dr. Ndiaye's foresight. Created in response to the devastating impact of the sovereign debt crisis of the 1980s on African economies, Afrexim Bank has become the African crisis management institution par excellence, helping its member countries to better absorb numerous episodes of economic shocks since its creation. The bank has proven its market failure response capabilities over the years. If anyone has any doubt about the foresight and contribution of President Ndiaye, we invite that person to consider the following. Consider, in the absence of an Afrexim Bank, who have provided the over $20 billion Afrexim Bank has disbursed in the past 4 years in support of intra-African trade. Without an Afrexim Bank, who have provided the over $10 billion Afrexim Bank disbursed to some African central banks in 2016 that enabled the continent to achieve an orderly adjustment to the commodity price shock of that period. Who have provided the over $6 billion Afrexim Bank has so far disbursed to the continent to enable our countries contain the COVID-19 pandemic. Without an Afrexim Bank, on which institution will aspects of implementing the African Continental Free Trade Agreement hinge as it does today on Afrexim Bank? Will it have been easy to contemplate a Pan-African payment and settlement system? Would it have been possible to think of an AFCFTA adjustment facility without having to run cap in hand to others to help us? Would it have been possible to think about other AFCFTA enabling initiatives that Afrexim Bank is championing today? Without an Afrexim Bank, who will have been a partner of the African Development Bank to support the work the ADB is doing with regard to the public sector? One can go on endlessly in renditions of these rhetorical questions. The central message they convey, however, is that Dr. Ndiaye lived ahead of his time. He was Africa's Nostradamus, the man who saw tomorrow. Is it anyone that, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, why his memory must be kept alive, especially as Africa charts a course towards true economic independence? The 4th edition of the Ndiaye lecture holds in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. The implementation of containment measures to protect the population against the COVID-19 virus has resulted in sharp and synchronized global downturn, setting Africa on the path to its first recession in 25 years. The myriad of challenges associated with the pandemic namely a health crisis and an economic crisis, are all occurring in the context of heightened geopolitical rivalries and tensions. While before the pandemic, geopolitical tensions were escalating in many spheres: trade, technology, financial, currency, military, and overall struggle for global economic dominance. Years of globalization has created new centers of trade, finance, and economic power in parts of the world, including the global south. The ensuing rivalry is strengthening the effectiveness of the multilateral rule-based system that some say has been beneficial to the global economy. Developing countries which were either in the state of colonies or struggling for independence when the world order of Potsdam emerged after World War II have made significant progress on the economic development ladder. Though still mostly underrepresented in leading institutions that were established after World War II and which have governed the world order over the last 75 years, the South is increasingly a leading driver of global growth and trade. It accounted for 40% of global GDP and 45% of global trade just last year. This was a sea change from the 1980s, when the developing South accounted for less than 17% of global GDP and 25% of global trade. Over the same period, China overtook the US as Africa's single largest trading partner. At the global level, China has become the largest trading nation in the world and has also overtaken the US as the largest economy of the world on PPP, purchasing power parity terms, based on IMF estimates. These tectonic shifts and dramatic changes appear to be in the verge of disrupting the old world order, thereby fostering global tensions. While the parameters of any new world order, if and when it emerges, are not yet known, the forces that will shape it are already obvious. So the questions are what to do, or what do the unfolding geopolitical developments portend for the global economy? What do they portend for the global financial architecture, the future of reserve currencies and payment system, as well as global value chains? What will be the future of multilateralism? Are there implications for Africa? How should Africa prepare for and respond to these tectonic shifts? To help us unpack most, if not all, of these thorny questions, most important of all, to help us answer the question of the future of Africa in the making of a new world order, we would not have found a better person than our keynote speaker, Professor Kishore Mahbubani, the founding dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. Professor Mahbubani is a career diplomat who rose to become Singapore's ambassador to the UN and served as the president of the UN Security Council while he was there. He's also a distinguished scholar and a global intellectual. Furthermore, he's a prolific author who has published 8 books, with several translated into more than 8 languages. The most recent one, released this year, Has China Won?, has already hit the bestseller list. A decade ago, the Financial Times listed Professor Mahbubani as one of the top 50 individuals who will shape the debate on the future of capitalism. In retrospect, the Financial Times was remarkably prescient in its assessment of Professor Mapubani's contributions to the world. Ambassador Mapubani has established himself as one of the foremost global thinkers with the courage to challenge the status quo. Please join me in welcoming a global independent thinker who will lead us as we reflect on the most relevant issue of our time, the making of a new world order and its implications for Africa. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, the Board of Directors, management and staff of our Afrexim Bank are most grateful to Professor Te and Mr. Chukwumerije for joining us today. We are also grateful and welcome Professor Kishore Mapubani as he prepares to take the stage for an insightful and vibrant exchange with a sizable global audience. We are indeed delighted, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, to have with us today about 2,000 participants, ranging from ministers, central bank governors, bankers, diplomats, corporate leaders, civil servants, leaders of the academia, NGOs, and so on. We are pleased that you could join us during this hectic period to sustain the legacy of the late Dr. Babaka Ndiaye. We must thank the Ndiaye family who have also joined this call for leaving the legacy of their father. I'm also grateful to my colleagues who worked tirelessly to organize this event, which has become an important annual gathering for Africa and the world. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Orama. Thank you for your thoughts. Thank you for making us absolutely think about some of the opportunities that we see around the world and the work that is being done by institutions such as the Import Bank. Thank you for introducing our keynote for today. Ladies and gentlemen, help me to welcome
President Orama, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is truly a great honor to be invited to deliver the Babaka Ndiaye lecture, especially after so many distinguished predecessors, and a special joy and pleasure for me because I am an old friend of Africa. And my thesis today is a remarkably simple one. In the first half of the 21st century, we'll be moving into the Asian century. By the second half of the 21st century, we'll be moving into the Afro-Asian century. In 1955, we had the first Afro-Asian conference in Bandung. Let's meet again in 2055 in Bandung to celebrate the Afro-Asian century. So the goal of my lecture today is to explain how we will get there. Let me acknowledge immediately that my thesis is controversial. Indeed, it's not only controversial, it will be laughed out of court by conventional Western minds who cannot believe that the era of Western domination of world history will ever end. And since my lecture will take you into unfamiliar territory, let me also explain why it will look unfamiliar. When we venture into new territory, we are guided by maps. Unfortunately, most of our mental maps are still Anglo-Saxon. What do most members of the elites around the world read? They read the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Economist, or Time Magazine. These are great newspapers, great journals. But they exist in an Anglo-Saxon intellectual bubble. It's a self-referential universe. They cite each other. But to be fair, they occasionally publish my articles, as the Financial Times and the Economist have done this year. But for most of the time, they reflect the views of the Western minds who make up 12% of the world's population. And my goal today is to try and provide the perspectives of the remaining 88%. So why am I confident that the Western domination is ending? Let me begin with a personal story. When I was born in 1948 in Singapore, I was born in a poor family in a poor British colony, and indeed I was put on a special feeding program when I was 6 years old because I was technically undernourished. Now you can see I'm overnourished. But, you know, we had a rough time. We had no flush toilet. But most importantly, our minds were culturally colonized. As an Asian, I grew up believing that we were inferior to Western people. And indeed, my 6-year-old classmate, Morgan, told me that when he grew up, he wanted to go to London because the streets in London were paved with gold. But today, the per capita income of Singapore of 65,000 US dollars is higher than the British per capita income of US 43,000. And frankly, today, most Asians do not believe that they're culturally inferior. Indeed, of the leading American universities, the top performers, especially in science and engineering, are Asian, and many of the leading American universities are being sued by Asian Americans for not admitting enough Asian Americans into their college. So what happened? How did the Asians of my childhood go from believing that they were culturally inferior towards believing that they were as good as the rest of the world? I have written 8 books, as President Obama mentioned, explaining why Asia is returning in strength. Eventually, as Africans learn also from the success stories of Asia, Africa will also return in strength. Hence, I'm very confident that we're going to move into the Afro-Asian century in the second half of the 21st century. At the end of the day, all human beings are equal, and we all have equal potential. That's the key point. So how does one explain the Asian story? There are many ways, but I'm going to use a simple 3-word formula with the acronym MPH. Now, MPH doesn't stand for miles per hour. MPH stands for Meritocracy, Pragmatism, and Honesty. There is one additional reason why I'm using MPH. It explains both the good performance of Asian societies in recent decades and the relative poor performance of Western societies in recent times. Now, here is one important statistic, and I think President Obama also referred to it. In purchasing power parity terms, China's economy was 1/10, let me repeat, 1/10 that of the United States in 1980. By 2014, China's economy had become bigger. How did China's economy become bigger? The answer is MPH, as I will explain. So let me start with meritocracy. And here I want to inject another very important statistic. If you can, please remember this. From the year 1 to the year 1820, for 1800 of the last 2,000 years, the 2 largest economies of the world were always those of China and India. It's only in the last 200 years that Europe took off, followed by the United States. So if you view the past 200 years of world history against the backdrop of the past 2,000 years of world history, the past 200 years of Western domination of world history have been a major aberration. Now, all aberrations come to a natural end, and hence now in PPP terms, the top 4 economies in the world are China, USA, India, and Japan. So 3 out of the top 4 are already Asian. That's why I say it's the Asian century. So the question still remains, why did the West shoot ahead of much of the rest of the world in the 19th and 20th century? How could the people coming from one small continent, Europe, conquer the whole world and indeed colonize India and humiliate China in the 19th century? The answer is complicated. Thousands of books have been written about the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the Industrial Revolution, which propelled forward the Western societies. Clearly, something magical happened to Western minds in the past few centuries. And the key word here is minds. Why did China and India have the largest economy of the world for 1800 years? The simple answer is that the minds in China and India were performing at the same level as European and American minds. 2 big changes happened in the 19th century. First, the huge leaps in science and technology propelled by Western minds gave Western societies tremendous material power. Secondly, and equally importantly, mass education meant that the minds were tapped from all layers of Western societies and not just among the top aristocrats. The shift from feudal political structures to democratic political systems also led to the education of the masses, and European and American societies enjoyed great social mobility. I want to emphasize mobility, and I'll explain why. Many in the West, therefore, believe that the critical reason why the Western societies have performed well is because they are democracies. Yet, in the past 3 decades, China, which is not a democracy, the Chinese people have experienced the best 40 years of social and economic development in 4,000 years of Chinese history. Let me repeat that, the best 40 years in 4,000 years of Chinese history. And by contrast, the United States, which is the loudest democracy in the world, is the only major developed society where the average income of the bottom 50% has gone down over a 30-year period. What went wrong? The one answer is meritocracy. In a reversal of past historical patterns, China has successfully utilized the minds of a much larger section of Chinese society. Indeed, Chinese society has become one of the most meritocratic societies in the world because it looks for the best minds anywhere in Chinese society and propels them upwards. The number of Chinese people going on to tertiary education, and this is a stunning statistic, okay, has gone up from 1.13% in 1980 to 50.6% in 2018. So in 38 years, from 1% to 50%. And by contrast, the United States has gone in the opposite direction. It has become a plutocracy. Now, what's the difference between a democracy and a plutocracy? In a democracy, you have a government of the people, by the people, for the people. But in a plutocracy, you have the government of the 1%, by the 1%, for the 1%. And if you want data to back up this claim, please look at Chapter 7 of my book, Has China Won? But please let me emphasize that I'm not the only person calling the United States a plutocracy. The late Paul Volcker, I'm sure many of you know him, the most revered chairman of the Federal Reserve of the United States, the Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz, who delivered this lecture also in 2017, and Martin Bo for the Financial Times, have all called the United States a plutocracy. And here is one concrete example of what goes wrong in a society when it becomes a plutocracy. Edward Luce of the Financial Times says, and I quote him, and this is about the US, studies show that an 8th grade, 14-year-old child from a lower income bracket who achieved math results in the top quarter, is less likely to graduate from a kid in the upper income bracket scored in the bottom quarter. Edward Luce says, this is the reverse of how meritocracy should work. Notice, he uses the word meritocracy too. Therefore, to give the simplest possible explanation of why Asian societies are doing well now, it is this. Asia always had the world's largest pool of brains. Sadly, it also had the world's largest pool of unused brains. Now these unused brains are being used. And at the end of the day, demographics matter. Hence, the future relations between Africa and Europe will be determined by demographics. In 1980, the EU's combined population, 379 million, was nearly double that of Africa's in 1950. Double. Today, Africa's population, 1.3 billion in 2018, is double that of the European Union in 2018. And by 2100, Africa's population is projected to be almost 10 times larger than Europe's. 4.5 billion versus 493 million. So in 2100, Africa's population will probably be about the same as Asia's. And this is why I'm glad that when President Obasanjo also delivered this lecture, he said education is key when he spoke in 2018. So in China, the number of children who have completed secondary education has gone up from 43% in 1980 to 88% in 2010. In Africa, the comparable numbers are 24% in 1990 and 44% in 2019, and this can rise. Therefore, with sincere apologies for making a very simple point, if Africa can utilize the same percentage of brains as Asian societies have done, African economies will become as big. It definitely is going to happen. But to achieve this goal, Africa also needs to pay attention to the second key word I mentioned, which is pragmatism. Pragmatism is essentially a Western concept. But the best definition of it was given by the Chinese leader, Deng Xiaoping, when he said, it does not matter whether a cat is black or a cat is white. If it catches mice, it is a good cat. With this simple analogy, Deng Xiaoping justified China's abandonment of the Soviet Union's centrally planned economic system and the switching to free market economic systems. And with this simple switch, the Chinese economy exploded. Equally importantly, Deng Xiaoping realized that China had fallen behind the West because it had tried to build a great wall, the Great Wall of China, to cut itself off from the world. He did the opposite. And this is why when President Xi Jinping spoke in Davos in January 2017, he explained how incredibly difficult it was when China took the plunge into the choppy waters of globalization. He said, and I quote, "We have had our fair share of choking in the water and encountered whirlpools and choppy waves, but we have learned how to swim in the process." It has proven to be a right strategic choice. Whether you like it or not, the global economy is the big ocean that you cannot escape from, unquote, President Xi Jinping. In short, China succeeded because it made two pragmatic U-turns. First, one U-turn away from the centrally planned system. Second, a U-turn away from a closed economic system. And by a remarkable accident of history, and future historians will marvel at this, by a remarkable accident of history, China's decision to become more pragmatic coincided with a decision by the West, especially the United States, to become more ideological. And this happened around the early 1990s. Because the destruction of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the subsequent collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 created naturally hubris and arrogance in the West. And this was best expressed in a famous essay by Francis Fukuyama called The End of History. His thesis was complicated, but the Western audiences only heard one message. Western societies had triumphed. The 12%, as I mentioned earlier, 12% who lived in the West could carry on autopilot, no U-turns necessary. The rest of the world, the 88% of the world's population, had to adjust and adapt. The West need not do so. So as I explain in my book, Has the West Lost It? This essay did a lot of brain damage to the West because it put the West to sleep in the 1990s at precisely the moment when China and India decided to wake up. So instead of an end of history moment, the world was experiencing a return of history moment. So with a natural return of China and India as high-performing economies. However, the West could not see this because the Western minds were drowning themselves in an ocean of ideological superiority. So instead of making pragmatic adjustments to the return of Asia, the West continued on autopilot. So let me just tell you a few stories from Singapore to drive home the importance of pragmatism. The real architect of Singapore's extraordinary economic success was the Deputy Prime Minister, Dr. Goh Keng Swee, a very distinguished economist, PhD from LSE. He shared with me a very wise observation, very wise. He said to me, Kishore, no matter what problem Singapore encounters, somebody somewhere has solved it. All we have to do is to copy their solution and adapt it to Singapore. That's how pragmatic he was. And I'm surprised that people actually don't spend more time studying Singapore's public policies because we have copied the best policies from the world. Dr. Goh also rejected conventional wisdom. In the 1960s and 1970s, the Third World rejected foreign direct investment, FDI, because it was deemed to be exploitative. Singapore embraced FDI as it provided capital, markets, and jobs. And here, let me add another important point. Dr. Goh was always curious and interested in success stories. Now contrast this with the West today. President Obama mentioned COVID-19. It's very clear that East Asia has handled COVID-19 much better than the West has. The death rate per million has been below 10 in East Asian countries, South Korea, Japan, China, Vietnam, Singapore. In the US and Europe, the advanced countries, Belgium, France, UK, USA, it has been in the hundreds. And the simple question to ask is this: has a single Western country sent a delegation to East Asia to find out why is East Asia coped so well with COVID-19? And the answer is zero. Zero. But I want to emphasize that East Asia and ASEAN have not just been pragmatic in the economic sphere, they've also been pragmatic in geopolitics. And the one country that demonstrates the value of pragmatism much more than any other country is Vietnam. Let me explain why. During the Cold War, Vietnam was a solid ally of the Soviet Union. Indeed, during the Cold War, the biggest wars of the Cold War were fought in Vietnam. Vietnam was also hostile to the 6 non-communist countries of ASEAN, including Singapore, in the Cold War. Hence, when the Soviet economy collapsed, and especially when the Russian economy collapsed, Vietnam's economy should have also collapsed. Just like Cuba's GNP declined by at least 35% between 1989 and 1993 because of the loss of 80% of its trading partners and Soviet subsidies. So Vietnam should have collapsed. Instead of collapsing, Vietnam's economy exploded in the 30 years after the Cold War ended. Why? The simple answer is pragmatism. It made peace with China. The most heavily militarized border between China and Vietnam became a heavily traded border. More importantly, Vietnam joined the camp of its adversaries in ASEAN. It learned from ASEAN and opened the doors to foreign investments. The results of Vietnam have been absolutely spectacular. The Vietnamese economy grew at an average rate of 6.7% from 1993 to 2019. Poverty in Vietnam went down from 51.9% in 1992 to 1.9% in 2018. And in 2016, the former president of the World Bank, Mr. Jim Yong Kim, said that Vietnam's annual growth rate of nearly 7% over the previous 25% had enabled the economy to leapfrog the middle income status in a single generation. And during the same period, Kim noted, Vietnam had managed the especially remarkable achievement of reducing extreme poverty from 50% to just 3%. Now, to drive home this point, let me add that Vietnam was at war longer than, say, Somalia. Now, can you imagine Somalia as a miracle growth economy? That's what Vietnam has achieved after the war stopped. But to understand further how dramatic the pragmatic of ASEAN and Vietnam has been, please compare this with the other examples of Cold War adversaries, the European Union and Russia. In theory, the European Union is more advanced and more developed than ASEAN. It should have been a wiser organization. Instead, to call a spade, it has behaved more stupidly than ASEAN. It continued its ideological crusade against Russia by expanding NATO, the enemy of Russia, right up to Russia's border. But ASEAN did the opposite. It embraced its former enemy, Vietnam, and said, come and join us. The results are clear. Both ASEAN and Vietnam have done much better. Now, I'm telling this story only for one reason. If the African Union is looking for models of regional cooperation to follow, it should not just follow the European Union model, it should also study ASEAN. As I document in my book, The ASEAN Miracle, ASEAN is a miracle. Now, let me turn now to my final point, honesty. I should emphasize that this is by far the most important factor for succeeding in development. When I spoke at a UN conference in Antalya, Turkey, in 1990, 30 years ago, I wrote 10 commandments for development. And one of the commandments I said, thou shalt acknowledge that corruption is the single most important cause for failures in development. I still believe what I said 30 years ago. However, I did not anticipate that corruption would decrease in China and rise in the United States. In theory, what I said is not true. Transparency International ranks China as being more corrupt than the United States. The US is 23 out of 198. China is number 80. Transparency International is right about illegal corruption. It is higher in China. However, it does not measure legal corruption. Now, what is legal corruption? Legal corruption takes place when companies are legally allowed to give money to get politicians elected who will then pass legislation to ensure that those companies either get tax breaks or regulatory relief. Let me give two examples. Hedge fund managers pay less taxes than ordinary citizens in the US because Congress legislated less taxes on carried interest. Carried interest is taxed as capital gains at 20% instead of an income tax which could have been 37%. Secondly, the US House of Representatives passed legislation preventing US government agencies from regulating lower prices from US pharmaceutical companies. So the companies could set their prices. US Congress decided that. Legally, all this is not corruption because Congress passed these laws. Functionally and ethically, this is corruption. The net result of all this legal corruption is that the US has seen a dramatic increase in inequality, which is why it is a plutocracy. The rich are better off and the poor are worse off. Now, a former New York Times correspondent, Anand Giridharadas, describes what has happened, and I'm going to quote him. He says, quote, "A successful society is a progress machine. It takes in all the raw material of innovations and produces broader human advancement." He says, America's machine is broken. When the fruits of change have fallen on the United States in recent decades, the very fortunate have bracketed almost all of them. For instance, the average pre-tax income of the top 10% of Americans has doubled since 1980. That of the top 1% has more than tripled, and that of the top 0.01% has risen more than sevenfold, even as the average pre-tax income of the bottom half of Americans, as I mentioned earlier, has stayed almost precisely the same. These familiar figures amount to 3.5 decades of wondrous head-spinning change with zero impact, as he says, zero impact on the average pay of 117 million Americans. And as I said earlier, in contrast to the plight of the bottom 50% in the United States, the bottom 50% in China have had their best 40 years of socioeconomic advancement in 4,000 years of Chinese history. The progress machine in China has not broken down. Now, please let me conclude quickly by explaining how the MPH formula is relevant to Africa. First, on meritocracy, the biggest asset that Africa has is not its vast natural resources or its forests. Africa will soon have the world's largest collection of young minds. Universal education can tap these minds. Fortunately, as I mentioned earlier, the percentage of children achieving secondary school education in Africa has gone up from 24% in 1990 to 44% in 2019. So what Asia has accomplished to educating its young minds, Africa can do also. Secondly, on pragmatism, as I said, Asia has succeeded first by copying best practices from the West, including the mastery of science and technology and free market economics. Paradoxically, in walking away from globalization and free trade agreements, the West is abandoning its own best practices. Fortunately, again, Africa has been very wise in adopting the African Continental Free Trade Agreement in 2018. Now, let me add one important geopolitical point. When the primary trading partner of Africa was the West could bully Africa, and it did so, as Joseph Stiglitz has confirmed. However, if Africa can develop equally strong trade links with, say, China and India, no external power can then bully Africa. And this is the ultimate paradox about trade. In theory, it creates dependence. In practice, it creates independence. Trade does that. Finally, the importance of honesty is self-explanatory. It needs no clarification. But I do want to repeat one sentence from last year's lecture by General William Ward. He said, and I quote, "I often use this simple litmus test. A young boy or girl walking down the street or in the countryside of an African village sees a soldier, sees a policeman. And is her reaction one to run and hug the police person or soldier around the knees, or to run away?" Unquote. The same litmus test can be applied to leaders. Do the people hug them or run away from them? Fortunately, the two most honest leaders of the 20th century were born in Asia and Africa. I'm referring to Mahatma Gandhi and Nelson Mandela. Let us honor their contribution and aspire to be as honest as Gandhi and Mandela, and this will ensure that the 21st century, the second half, will be the Afro-Asian century. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Mabubani. That was quite an inspirational message, quite thought-provoking, actually. There are so many things I know for sure I will never see the words MPH or the letters MPH or acronym really at this point ever the same way again. Let me ask if a moderator, Mr. Godfrey, is online. Godfrey, are you there?
I am online, Des. I am online, and I had sat at my desk and I had become a student again because I was trying to get all these points and make sure that I capture as many of them in my head. I don't know what you took away, Des. I took away a number. Yes, I took MPH as well, miles per hour, no more. It is meritocracy, it is pragmatism, it is honesty. I also got to think again about what that great man, Steve Biko, said. And I quote him here. He says, the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. And the professor here emphasized absolutely the importance of changing our mindset in how we approach our problems. I mean, I could go on and on and on. All of us have our key takeaways. And I'm hoping that in our private lives, in our private spaces, we take those takeaways and we do something in those spaces to advance the cause of the African continent. At this juncture, I'd like to open up the lecture to questions from all of you from around the world. And I see a lot of you have already been very, very active. A number of questions have already come in for the president. A number of questions have already come in for the professor as well. So rather than putting in my questions, I would rather I put in your questions and we get this discussion rolling. Let me get to our questions. While we allow the professor to catch his breath, I wanted to begin with the president and give you some of the questions that have come through so far. Right. Now, the first question that I have here came from Yamkela Makupula, and the question is, how will the Africa Continental Free Trade Area affect the global markets, especially China and US? President, allow me to add a little question to that as well. How do we take advantage of the discord, let me call it that way, between China and the US to ensure Africa's interests are advanced? Mr. President.
Well, thank you very much. I don't think the AFCFTA has been created as a version of this beggar thy neighbor policy. I think the AFCFTA is, as Professor Mabubani mentioned, one big move by Africa to take its destiny in its own hands. And Africa is doing that not in response to anything. Like the rivalry between the US and China and whatever may fall, maybe the fallout of that for the continent. But because the continent sees it as something it has to do to begin to take itself out of poverty, to begin to make itself a global economic power. Look at it this way. Some of us believe that one of the key reasons Africa is where it is today is because of its history of colonialism. You have a continent as huge as Africa with all the resources, the human beings, the natural resources, and the arable land and so on. They're divided into 55 countries 84,000 kilometers of borders. And if you've seen the speech of one of the colonial administrators, which I normally like to present, was Mr. Sarao in 1920, where he captured the let's say the philosophy behind colonialism. One thing, the metropolitan powers never wanted the colonies to deal with their neighbors. They wanted the colonies to remain producers of raw materials, which will be transferred to the metropolis to manufacture goods and then re-export to the colonies. They were not to have any connection with their neighbors for anything. What that then meant was that we had a continent where somebody in Ghana would know more about what was happening in, say, in the UK than what was happening in Cote d'Ivoire. Somebody in Cote d'Ivoire would know more about what was happening in France than what was happening in Ghana. So we couldn't deal with ourselves. And that then meant that we couldn't have built regional value chains. It then meant that we couldn't use the power of a market that is integrated to promote economic development and growth. So that is what the AFCFTA now wants to do. It wants to begin to integrate the continent, create opportunity for markets to emerge, for global value chains to emerge, and then allow the continent producers to gain dynamic comparative advantage in producing certain kinds of goods. This will make it then possible for those producers to become stronger to compete in the global market, because today we can't. We are still able to compete only with commodities, but we've seen what dependence on commodities means for all of us. So we need to move away from that, and the FCFTA will help us move away from that.
Thank you, Professor Orama, for that answer. Because we've got so many questions, Professor, I'm going to ask you to perhaps take two at a time so that we can get through as many as possible. I've got a question here from Sylvie Ogudeji. Can you hear me?
Yes. I can hear you.
Yes, thank you. I've got a question from Sylvie Ogudeji from UNECA, United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. The question goes, Prof, how could Africa teach more, quote, pragmatism and, quote, development mindset to her children? That's one question. I want to add another one quickly so that we try to cover as many as we can. This one comes from Oliver, and it goes, the success of Asia is also about technological catch-up and sustained investment in human capital. Can Africa aspire and ultimately lead half of the 21st century, just over 30 years from now, without closing the gap in the areas of technology and innovation?
Thank you.
Professor
Two excellent questions. Now, and by the way, pragmatism, pragmatism is a very big word, and it sounds very philosophical. But actually, as I told the students at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy when I was dean, I said the one lesson that if you want to learn from Singapore is exactly what I said when Dr. Goh Keng Swee said. Dr. Goh Keng Swee said, no matter what problem Singapore encounters, somebody somewhere has encountered it. There's no such thing as a new problem. Every problem somebody has solved somewhere. So he says, go out and copy. So I told the students of the Lee Kuan Yew School, frankly, my biggest advice to you when you go home is to study best practices from other countries and copy them. But I said, don't copy in the exams. You can copy elsewhere, Copy best practices, copy how to build a port, copy how to build an airport, copy how to build a hospital, copy how to build a school, copy investment legislation, copy intellectual property. You can copy everything. And so that's essentially what pragmatism is. And that's why I say people should come to Singapore and learn from Singapore, because Singapore has been the best copycat nation in the world. Most of the policies you see in Singapore are policies we copied from others. So we're happy to share with everybody, including Africa. So that's what pragmatism is. And I think that's not so difficult. On the technology front, clearly it is a challenge. But at the same time, I think, just as India, as you know, India for many times, they said, in the case of India, half of the Indian population was waiting for a telephone, and the other half of India's population was waiting for a dial tone. This is the old landline telephones. But then you got wonderful cell phones, and guess what? Today, just about almost every Indian today has a cell phone. So you didn't have to have landlines. So India made a leapfrog over landlines towards getting cell phones. And today, cell phones are becoming increasingly smartphones that provide lots of data. So in the same way, I would say in Africa, Africa can use digital technology to leapfrog. So for example, 30 years ago, if we had COVID-19, I could not have been giving this lecture to, they say, 2,000 people have signed up. There's no way I could have spoken to 2,000 people in Africa. But today I'm sitting here in Singapore, and you are in South Africa, and these 2,000 people are probably all over Africa, and they can hear you and they can hear me. And this is technology. And this is, by the way, very cheap technology, right? Digital technology, you don't require huge infrastructure, right? Frankly, if you're in a village and you have a solar panel, right, and a good Wi-Fi connection, guess what? You're on. You're connected to the world. So I would say take advantage of this digital technology, take advantage of solar panels, and spread it out as quickly as possible. And by the way, Africa is ahead in some areas, I must explain. In the case of mobile payments, for example, I think Kenya is way ahead of Singapore. Singapore should go one day and learn from Kenya how to catch up on mobile payments.
I will take that. We'll definitely take that and wear it as a badge of honor. Thank you, Prof. Mr. President, let me come to you. I'm also going to give you the questions in twos so that we can cover as many of them as possible. Maybe I can also throw in one or two of mine. The next question goes, do you see Africa reclaiming the leadership of the world within the next 35 to 40 years? And what role will trade play in that speedy renaissance path? Nice question. Very succinct, thank you. The other question is, under your leadership, the bank has invested a lot, working closely with the African Union to advance implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. What role will the AFCFTA play in the expected return of Africa into the world center stage within the next 4 decades? I think there's similarity in those questions, Mr. President.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, they are almost dissenting, claiming the leadership of the world. I think that Professor Mabani are giving a recipe for that, the MPH. We need to deal with MPH to claim the leadership of the world. And he also said something when he was starting, the Afro-Asian century. The 2055 conference he mentioned. But having said this, I think all the ingredients for Africa to lead the world is there. Whereas in many parts of the world, people are aging. Africa has a vibrant young population. And somebody referred to it to say you have all these young minds, and that takes us again to the fundamentals, MPH. So you have the ingredients, you need to cook it to be able to achieve what you want to achieve. So we have the people. When others are aging, we have the young minds. Young minds, not only for thinking, but also to do the work that one needs to do, and also to be a market, because when populations are going down, the market size naturally would go down. Whereas when you have the continent with population the way it is today, then that place will be where the market will be. That's where everybody wants to be. So that ingredient is there. And of course, we've talked about the natural resources, but I started with the human beings because the greatest resource we have actually are human beings, not those natural resources. But once you have the human beings, then the natural resources start making sense. But we have them. Water is a major issue today in many parts of the world. But you have abundance of water in Africa. You have abundance of arable land in Africa. You have abundance of key minerals in Africa. We have very good water to be able to produce. So all these are there. So what we need to do is to then apply those basic principles, which again, I repeat that Principal Body has helped us to say meritocracy, pragmatism, and honesty. If we have leaders, and all of us, because not only the leaders, if we then have this and apply them in the way we define our strategy for development, I believe that even before 2055, Africa can begin to claim the leadership of the world.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you. I'm going to push as many as I can, and I think my questions are dead. I'll put them in my pocket for the next time. But keep those questions coming in, and I will get them to both professors to try to get some answers. Choro Jiang, Embassy of the Republic, I can't say which republic it is, but the question is, what is the role of political leadership in changing the mindset of Africa on the basis of MPH? I think this goes to you, to Professor Mabubani. Second question that we'll take in this is coming through from Rupert Lewis. He asks, how will the African diaspora be incorporated in the economic and political processes? The Chinese diaspora was crucial to Singapore, China, and Vietnam's development. Professor Mabubani.
Thank you. On the first question on the role of leaders, I think leaders are obviously critical. But quite often I find that our leaders, and I'll be very frank with you, okay? And especially people of my age, okay, in the 70s, we grew up in the Anglo-Saxon intellectual bubble. And we assume that, all the answers you're going to get will come from London, from Paris. But frankly, London and Paris are cities of yesterday. And Shanghai and Singapore are cities of tomorrow. I mean, to put it very bluntly. And so you want to go to the cities of yesterday or the cities of tomorrow for the answers. And I think the reason why I use this MPH formula, and I'm glad Professor Orama has also mentioned it too, is that it explains, hopefully in very simple terms, that Africa's biggest asset are its young people. You have remarkable number of young people. These are your biggest asset. So if you can provide even basic education to them, I can tell you that investors will come to Africa. So that's why I would say, look at not what you don't have, look at what you have, which is this largest pool of young minds. And this is what I think the leaders should focus on. Now, on the second question on diaspora, I think it's very critical. And in fact, by the way, I mentioned about Asia having the world's largest pool of brains, but also the world's largest pool of unused brains. But I can tell you, in the 1980s, the then Prime Minister of India, Rajiv Gandhi, was asked, are you worried about the brain drain from India going to America? And he gave a very wise answer. The Prime Minister of India, he said, better a brain drain than a brain in the drain. So it's better for the people to go out. And today, the most successful diaspora in the world is the Indian community in the United States. And you know, the United States has the most competitive laboratory in the world, and the most successful ethnic group in the United States is not Japanese or the Jews or the South Koreans or the Chinese, it's the Indian community. So the diaspora, and you know, the head of two of the world's largest corporations, Microsoft is Satya Nadella, Google is Sundar Pichai. It shows you the power of a diaspora. So I would say, frankly, I would actually encourage Africa to allow a diaspora to take place. Because the diaspora today will bring magnificent rewards tomorrow.
I am remembering what you said during the lecture. You said, where are our best brains? And you said we needed to make sure that we're using our best brains. And we know that some of our best brains are sitting in the diaspora. Thank you, sir, for that. All right, let me go to President Orama. We're going TikTok here. If there's any irony or point of connection, well, it's TikTok times, isn't it? Professor Orama, this question comes from Wendy Luhabe. We know she's a businesswoman here in South Africa. The question goes, one of our comparative advantages in Africa is agriculture. Why are we not developing an Africa-wide strategy to feed the world safe? Second question that will come to that comes from Eugene Nwikina, FIT group of companies. With technology leading the way in several sectors, how has Afrexim Bank helped to support this happening, Professor Orama?
Yes, thank you very much to those who have these insightful questions. So agriculture, yes, that is something the continent needs to do something about. First of all, we've said that we have a large and rising population, but we also have to feed them. To feed your population, it's either you are able to create wealth, to be self-sufficient by producing things and importing food to eat, or you produce it yourself. Where we are today is that it is critical because we develop agriculture, because that is what employs a great part of our population. And we have the resources to do so. We should have the comparative advantage. Various studies have shown that the continent has 60% of world's arable land. So if other people are coming to buy land in Africa to be able to grow food to feed their own people, we should be able to use our own land and develop agriculture to feed ourselves. So I agree with the question that we must do something, but the African Union is doing something there. I think the commission that is in charge of agriculture has a robust strategy for the continent, including work to make sure that we use technology that is not harmful to the environment to be able to produce enough to feed ourselves. But for that to happen, to make it possible for us to feed ourselves, we have to also look at the AfCFTA, because we have to bring down the borders and open the markets so that somebody who is producing in South Africa can actually supply the market in Nigeria. What we have today, because we do not have information. What Nigeria doesn't have, but it goes and imports from somewhere else. Whereas South Africa exports the same thing to another part of the world. So it's the AFCFTA that has to deal with this. So while we do the agricultural strategy, the plan for the agriculture for the continent, we must also make it a part of the discussion on the free trade area. Because the free trade area that will open the market, if farmers have access to markets, then there will be incentives to make the investments we need to make to grow our agriculture. If the markets remain small, atomistic, you will not get those investments that will grow our agriculture. We will remain at subsistence level of production. The focus is on not only doing the things that we need to do to make Africa more productive in terms of agricultural productivity and what we produce, but also making sure that when we then produce, that we are able to trade what we produce so that we can feed ourselves and reduce hunger. And then I go to the issue of technology. Yes, the world is going to be defined, the future of the world is going to be defined more and more by technology. Oh, those these and
we can hear you.
Yeah, he's saying that my session will yes, okay. Defined by technology.
I got the same message too. My session will end.
they have to do something, otherwise it will cut off, apparently.
I'm sure they are fixing it, Professor.
All right.
We can still hear you.
Yeah, and digital technology is the issue. For us at Afrexim Bank, we have also placed technology at the center of what we are doing. Because it is only technology that can help Africa leapfrog so many of the things that are just ahead of it. We look at what we are doing with the payment. Look at what we are doing with trade information and so on. But I would want to say more about them because they are important. Although we have signed the Continental Free Trade Agreement, which is a huge thing politically, but that is only a political move. That will not bring down the borders. It will not immediately take us out of where we are due to so many years of these divisions we've suffered. But it's technology that will do that. It's technology that will make it possible for Africans to know what is happening within Africa. It is technology that will make us to relate with others just across the border. And that is why we are investing in it as a bank. By November, we will start piloting the first Pan-African payment and settlement system. This system will make it possible for Africans to pay for inter-African trade in their local currency. What that will do is that it will bring back to Africa large volumes of trade that are diverted because of currency issues. That will again also open the market up and make it possible for people to search for what to buy and search for markets within the continent. We are already in the final stages of putting in place a trade information portal, which will use artificial intelligence to predict supply chains within the continent. That would also make it then possible for Africans to identify markets within the continent. In about, I think, a week or 2 weeks, we'll also be launching operationally the African Customer Due Diligence Repository platform, which we've named the MANSA platform. Because we've not been dealing with ourselves, business people, banks do not trust African businesses. They don't trust African banks. But we have to do something about it. And doing something about it means providing a platform where we would have information about everybody, so we know what is going on, we know who we are dealing with. That we believe will make it easier for banks to do due diligence on companies and other banks across the border. And that will make it easier then for intra-regional banking relationships to happen, for intra-regional trade to happen. We have about, I think, 15 or 16 countries that are landlocked. These landlocked countries, for you to move goods around Africa, you need to post so many transit guarantees, transit bonds. So what we are doing, working also with the African Union, is to put in place a collaborative transit guarantee scheme that will make it possible and easier to issue those transit bonds and reduce the cost of conducting intra-regional trade. So these are all going to be technology driven, and that is why we are making those investments. And we will make them in a big platform which we call the African Trade Gateway, which we hope will provide a basis for those who are developing similar technologies to have them have access to markets, to hook into those that major platform that will be built around Afrexim Bank.
Absolutely. We look forward to all those interventions, Mr. President. No question about that. Time is an enemy here. We have run out of time, but I've been allowed to ask one more question. But I just wanted to add that, we've been talking about this $50 billion annually that we spend on food imports into the continent, money that should be supporting our currencies. Professor Mabubane, the last question comes to you. It goes something like this. Is Africa's trade with Asia ethical bilateral trade? Striking deals with Africa that underprice the African input but overprice the Asian contribution is unsustainable.
Well, one of the big lessons I learned in my life is that if you don't know the answer to a question, just say, I don't know. And I'm sure that the pricing mechanisms can be improved between Asia and Africa, but the lesson I've learned, it's all about supply and demand. And if you can increase the demand for African products, the price will go up. It's very simple. And so, and remember that the Chinese middle class is exploding. Really, the world's largest middle class is no longer in the United States, it's in China. Now, if you can produce products, I'll give you an example. Surprisingly, the Chinese middle class actually wants to have healthy products. And Africa can produce genuine, organic, healthy products. That's what you can be very good at. And that's your competitive advantage. And if you can get the demand rising for it, and I give you a concrete example, the kiwi fruit. It was a very ugly fruit, actually. The New Zealanders marketed it, made it look so attractive, that people started paying premium prices for an ugly fruit. So that's the trick, create a demand. And you have such wonderful, wonderful products in Africa, market them well, and the prices will go up.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor. So we have had one of those happy situations where we have had more questions than the answers. But I wanted to assure you that for all of you who put in your questions, they are going to be attended to, and some answers are going to be provided. But I'd like to thank our discussants, the professor, of course, Professor Mabubane, and Professor Benedict Orama, for your contributions, for your insights, and all of you who have been writing, who have been sending us those questions, and who have been listening and digesting what was discussed today. Thank you very much. I'm sure you'll agree with me that after such a heavy meal, you do need to sort of relax a little. So we're going to provide you some music, and appropriately, of course, it's from the motherland. It comes from the Gambia. It's a song by Sona Jobate, and it's called Bambia. Relax and enjoy. And then after that, by the way, I wanted to remind you, actually, we're going also to show you our next intra-African trade fair, which is taking place in Rwanda next year. It's taking place in Rwanda next year. This is the intra-African trade fair that is organized by the Afrexim Bank as well as the African Union. It's taking place in Rwanda, and one of the things that's going to be featured there is the creative arts. Well, here's a sample.
been a pleasure performing at the 4th Annual Babacar Njai Lecture, honoring the founding role that Dr. Babacar Njai played in the establishment of Afrexim Bank. I also want to congratulate Afrexim Bank and the amazing audience for continuing this tradition over the years, provoking conversation about our beloved continent. I'm also very grateful to be a part of this year's Babacar Njai Lecture. Thank you to all. Okay, Gambia, yeah.
Thank you, my sister.
Join Africa's largest trade and investment fair in Rwanda. Intra-African Trade Fair gives you access to more than 1,100 exhibitors, 10,000 visitors and buyers, and more than 5,000 conference delegates from more than 55 countries. Participate in trade and investment deals worth $40 billion as business and government come together to explore business and networking opportunities at the International Exhibition, brought to you by the African Export-Import Bank and their premium partners, the IATF 2021, Transforming Africa.
Indeed, Africa's transformation is taking place before our eyes. I hope you enjoyed the music, and I hope you also enjoyed, of course, the very thoughtful remarks that we've been hearing throughout the day about how to make sure that we do not miss this opportunity. Now, we need to move on now to the next part of our program, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Hippolyte Fofak. He is the chief economist of Afrexim Bank. He is an economist who's been writing about the continent for a very long time, and including one of his books, which is on indebtedness on the African continent. You can go out there and see if you enjoyed and get some insights out of that. He also has been writing about, of course, contemporary Africa. I hope many of you will remember that there is one African who is running, still in the running, for the World Trade Organization Director General, and that's Ms. Okonjo-Iweala, the former finance minister of Nigeria. We are obviously all rooting for her. And Dr. Fofak has written about that. You can also go out to the internet and check that one out. He's here. He will give us our closing remarks. Dr. Fofak.
Thank you very much, moderator. What a wonderful day. What a wonderful day, and what a strong participation and support from all over the world. I think we'd like to thank you all from all corners of the world for being part of the 4th editions of Afrexim Bank Day lecture this year, and for making the first digital editions of this annual lecture one of the most successful and memorable, record-setting in terms of participation and engagement, and so many insightful questions emerge from this vibrant exchange. I'd like to thank in particular Mrs. Arunma Ote for opening her heart to the world through humbling and educational moments she shared with her mentor and professional father, Dr. Babacar Ndiaye. I'd like to thank Mr. D.K. Chukwumeri, the poet, for his inspiring revelations on the trajectory of human history, I should say African history. Winston Churchill once made the observation that the further one goes back into history, the clearer the picture becomes. I repeat, the further one goes back into history, the clearer the pictures becomes. You've served us well through your insightful point on the trajectory of African history or world history. We'd like to thank Professor Kishore Mahbubani, our keynote speaker, for honoring the invitation of our president, His Excellency Professor Benedicto Rama, despite the competing demand on his time. We are very grateful, Professor. We'd like to thank you for a thought-provoking and inspiring lecture. For decades, you've been the geopolitical bridge between the West and the East, between the US and China. In the US, you are viewed as a Chinese ambassador. In China, you are viewed as a US ambassador. Your ability to be embraced by both superpowers really has made you the world diplomat par excellence. The keynote you deliver wonderfully today has made you an even greater diplomat, what we call a global ambassador, who can now connect East and West without discontinuity, ensuring that Africa is the resilient bridge connecting West and East. Professor Mabani, we are very grateful and would like to thank you for championing Africa and for reminding the world that every single region of the world should count in your more inclusive vision of globalization, especially in a world where the GDP numbers are changing so rapidly. You heard from President Rama how China has now overtaken the US in PPP term, becoming the largest economy in the world in the span of 2 decades. So it is possible and things can change. Also, in your brilliant lecture, talk about the return to history moment. That return to history moment will probably take the world back to the beginning of history. You've posited that the second half century will be the Afro-Asian century. Interestingly, and quite encouraging, is the consistency of your predictions with the African Union Agenda 2063, the Africa we want. If you look closely at that agenda, Africa is expected to become a fully integrated, prosperous, and dynamic forces in the international arena by 2063, in that second half of the century. In essence, the second half of the 21st century will be one of the most exciting moments in that long trajectory of human history. We'll be returned to the beginning of history. We're returning to the beginning of history, which all begins with Africa. But more than making a prophetic statement, Professor Mwabani provided a roadmap toward a fully integrated and prosperous world of global income convergence, where Africa will no longer be the Lilliputians of the world. In particular, he mentioned meritocracy, pragmatism, and honesty. He also emphasized technology and innovation in his talk, and later, this last technology has enabled the world to be ever more connected during the implementation of strict containment measures to stem the spread of COVID-19 virus. And it's likely to become, technology is likely to become an even more important tool in the coming years, not only for connectivity and knowledge sharing, but also to accelerate diversifications of sources of growth and boost African trade, both extra and intra-African trade, during the implementations of the AFCFTA. Afrexim Bank has been championing and leading the transformation of African economies through trade since inception. Hence, the bank welcomed the convergence of ideas and strategy, and will launch Afrexim Bank Community of Ideas as an online platform to sustain the vibrant debate generated by Professor Mwabani in his address today, and in the process, support implementations of the AFCFTA in the lead up to 2063, when the world finally returned to the beginning of history. I would like to encourage all participants to actually join that Afrexim Bank Community of Ideas as it's established, to be part of that exchange, of that knowledge generations, of that renaissance in the cultural space. Professor Mwabani's brilliant lecture will be disseminated through several means, including that community of ideas. We'll also be sharing with you digital copies of 2 important pieces of work. The first is a book on the history of African trade. The second is a proceedings of last year's lecture, which was on the intersection of security and development and the challenges that they pose for the implementations of the AFCFTA area. And of course, the proceedings of the brilliant lecture delivered by Professor Mwabani today will also be disseminated at some point next year when it is released. So please make sure we have your contact, the email contact, to share information with you. Finally, and as we look forward to sustaining the knowledge exchange via that Afrexim Bank Community of Ideas, I would like, on behalf of our President, His Excellency Professor Benedicto Rama to acknowledge and thank all those who worked tirelessly toward the success of this event, including our moderator, Mr. Godfrey Mutsizua, a legend in the African media world who will be going back to CNBC next month as chief editor. Professor Mogbani's staff, Carol Bertram, who have been working with us tirelessly over the last 2 months to make sure that this event is flawless. And of course, Brand Communication, IC Publications, as well as IT and other technical services for their support and tireless contribution to this event. And finally, thank you all for your time and continued support as we plan for the next event at some point next year, still around the World Bank IMF annual meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Fofak. You have been watching, I think, in many ways, an eye-opening event where we've been asking this question around trying to reassert Africa's role. Thank you, Dr. Fofak, for your thoughts. I have actually noted it down, Afrexim Bank community of ideas. Certainly an important, I think, platform that will help to shape these ideas from just being things that we talk about into practical solutions that help us in our daily work and our daily endeavors. Des, I don't know what stood out for you. As I said, I went back to school today. Never mind my white hair. I certainly went back to school. MPH is stuck. Minds is stuck. But for me, it's been a real pleasure moderating the debate, listening to all these wise minds, and picking up the brains of all the people who have been contributing to our debate today. Des?
Thank you so much, Godfrey. I've also left here probably a whole lot more educated than I did coming into this event. Many, many, many nuggets. Like I said, MPH means something very different to me right now. And so my thanks again to all the speakers. And it's certainly been a pleasure moderating the session with you today. Thanks to you all again for joining us. As Dr. Fofak mentioned, as a thanks to you, you will all be receiving a copy of the book, The History of African Trade, and a copy of the proceedings from the Babacar Ndiaye Lecture 2019. We do encourage you to go onto our social media pages, like us, follow us, join in on the conversation, follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. As I mentioned, this event has been live streamed on all the Afrexim Bank platforms. So by all means, follow us on those platforms at Afrexim Bank on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn, and at Afrexim Bank Official on Instagram. We would also officially like to announce our virtual event series, which the bank will be running, titled The Resilient Africa, of which this was the first, and there will be a series of other events in the next few months. So please look out on our social media pages as well, and your emails. We'll be getting some more information about that. Thank you all once again. Please do remember to fill out the surveys after the event is done in a few minutes. It'll only take you 1 minute, really, and so we can bring you better events and improve as a future, in the future as time goes on. So thank you all very much again, and we hope to see you next year at the 5th anniversary of the Babacar Ndiaye Lecture Series. But until then, I'm Adeza Nyoku. Please be well and stay safe. Thank you again.